So this week we're only going to be covering two chapters. I had toyed around with going all the way through chapter 23, but I'm going to be honest with you. I did not have enough time to flesh all that out and do it justice. So I thought I'll just save that and then try next week to get a three-chapter stint of 23 through 5. For the next section coming up, there really isn't a great way of breaking it up and keeping it all together because it spans about 5 chapters of material, so we're just going to have an odd break in there somewhere. Does anybody know offhand, since next week is not Thanksgiving week, but do we have church that upcoming Wednesday night? I wouldn't think so because I think in the past we typically don't do any. So just be prepared. I'll try to send that out as soon as I know, so nobody's geared up to come Wednesday night before Thanksgiving. But okay, so just a brief recap of what we've seen so far. Serves as our check on learning time. Chapters 1 through 12 we're calling what?
Microcosm.
There we go. And the reason why is because what? What is this kind of pitching us?
Let you know what the rest of the story's going to be.
There we go. Yeah, it's helping us see a more compressed part of the story that's dealing exclusively with 3 particular nations. Judah, but it does branch out to Israel, and then of course Assyria, with the fact that she is the looming threat on the horizon that God has tagged as his hammer of judgment. And he is going to use them to bring judgment in a very profound way. It's going to be a decimating judgment against this northern kingdom. They're not going to survive once Assyria is over and done with them. But Judah, while severely punished and chastised, will be allowed to survive. But all along the way, we've got hints and beautiful pictures of what God is going to do to try to reconcile his people to himself, purify them, which is seen very succinctly in the picture of Isaiah, right? And what we get with his call midway through this collage of pictures with respect to judgment and restoration that are all intertwined with each other. And with that, we understand that as he was purified, a man who was of unclean lips, living amongst an unclean people, but yet God atoned for his sins and allowed him to be able to speak and continue to serve as a witness to the people. That's important because he stands as a symbol of hope for what God is going to ultimately do for his covenant people. We'll see this start to make a lot more sense when we get to chapters 40 and beyond with respect to what God is going to continue to use ethnic Israel for in the arena of nations as a testimonial, a witness to the nations of God's faithful love, his kindness in spite of all of their heretical blasphemy and apostasy. But moving beyond that, now we're still firmly in this 10-chapter corridor of 20 or 13 through 23. And with that, we've got, that 6-nation breakdown on the one side of chapter 17. Chapter 17 ends with blasting out to basically all the nations and beyond with respect to the nations' rage. They roil like the uncontrolled, chaotic waters of the primordial, uncreated earth that God is rebuking, sending them back, showing the fact that God is the one who maintains sovereignty over all creation. But creation in this sense is his people. He is going to preserve his people. But we recognize from what Isaiah has already said, his people doesn't just necessarily mean those who share a bloodline with Abraham. This is all those who are going to become part of God's covenant family, which is what God had always intended through Abraham, right? And then another 6-nation breakdown on this side of 17. But as we work through these, what we've started to see developing is that there's a little bit of a difference between the previous 6-nation group before we got to 17 and including the former part of 17. And those oracles, it's straight point blank right at that particular nation group. They are called out. What we're going to see in what Isaiah is doing here, and we got a little glimpse of last week, is that he is not so much calling a particular nation group out, but he's using code terms for describing a particular nation group. And we, as the readers, are responsible for handling the text properly and then isolating the clues that help us understand who is this pointed to. But even though we might discover that as we work through the mystery, we think we know who he pointed this particular oracle to. The one thing that we need to make sure that we're tempering our discovery with is the understanding of the employment of archetypal language. In other words, he's building up to something that we're going to see once we get past chapter 23, discovering from chapters 24 up through at least 27. He's going to cap this whole 10-chapter corridor off with looking at a concept of the world being seen as but a nation. And by virtue of that, when God brings judgment upon this nation, and if you're watching this through the internet, hopefully you saw me on the screen using those air quotes, nation, it's a way of saying this is how God is going to deal with all the nations that in this day and time of Isaiah writing this and speaking this are empires, and these empires that stand against God's people as a threat. All right, so we're laying the seedbed down for what God is ultimately going to be doing to the empire that supersedes Assyria. And Isaiah has already started to deal with them, right? They were the subject of chapter 13 and 14 when we started this 10-chapter concourse. And then beyond the Babylonians, while Isaiah does nothing to treat the Persians, for the most part, he might briefly mention them in the later portions, beginning around chapter 44, 45, calling out Cyrus as the emperor of Persia who's going to bring decimation to Babylon, but at the same time, freedom and liberty to God's people to go back home. But that's about all he's going to say. And then, of course, nothing of the Greeks that will supersede the Persians or the Romans after them, or even up into our time. But the idea is that this is laying the fabric down for the understanding of how God is going to deal with the succession of superpowers, world powers, geopolitical events that swirl as they do to try to bring about an end to the picture of Psalm 2. God's king on God's mountain, and that king ruling over the nations. And God laughs at them. He scoffs at them, because while they scheme and they plan to break the chains that they see God has fettered them with and tying them to himself, God is the one who gets the last laugh in the end. And a dire warning given to all. You either embrace the Son and kiss him, or you will find yourself at the pointed end of the stick of his wrath. It's just that simple, right? Okay, so with that, let's dive into this material. We continue on with the understanding that these 10 chapters are dealing with the theme that I'm summing up here as the title of all of these slides: Judah's hope rests in Yahweh alone. That God is single-handedly dismantling all of these nations so that there's no crutch for them to lean on, because in this day and time, conventional wisdom would certainly point them in the direction of treaties, agreements with other kingdoms, aligning yourself with whoever can promise what and give you what in order to help you survive when it comes to Assyria and other major players that could potentially rival and challenge Assyria, but you're not really sure if that person's your enemy or your friend. And the old adage of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but that they could easily turn back into my enemy, and they have been all along. We're talking about people like Babylon and whatnot. And of course, that's going to come up later on in Isaiah as well, right? When we get to Isaiah 38, 39, and Hezekiah after his illness being restored, and then Merodach-Baladan, the king of Babylon, having wrestled himself out from underneath Assyrian control for a temporary time, is able to send envoys all the way across the Mesopotamian valley, right over to Judah, and say, hey, we're looking for an alliance here. And then Isaiah is the one who tells Hezekiah, these same people are going to come and cart off your sons and your wealth into exile someday. So they are to trust in Yahweh alone. This is the picture that Moses gave them when they were on the eastern side of the Jordan. When you go into that land, you do not make treaties with these people. You do not stand alone on the idea of how many horses you have, the chariots that they pull, or how big and strong your army is. That is not what is going to preserve you on the world stage, and it's not going to protect you in battle. I'm the one who delivers your enemies into your hands. I can take 5 of you and put 1,000 people to flight, or I can take 5 of them and put 1,000 of you to flight. It's going to go that way, depending upon how faithful you are to me. All right. So again, a good study Bible is probably going to have some subheadings there. The first thing I'm going to tell you is probably what? Take a wild guess. Not that it's wrong, but that we should ignore it. Ignore the subheading, because that's not what Isaiah starts this off with. The study Bible author, editor, is helping us. That's great. And in some ways, it can already situate us to what they know in advance is going to come up in the text. But in some ways, it does strip us of the investigative work that we as readers are intended to do. And so if we just blot that out for a second, and we pay attention to what Isaiah is actually saying when he begins this Messiah, or this burden against who he's calling the desert by the sea. So we'll work through this and see if we perhaps can discover who or what that is. So, natural questions we should be asking. What desert? What sea? Who is this? All right? Because everything he is going to say with respect to them is seemingly going to be very important, following on in the context of what we've had laid down prior to this. A troubling vision is declared to me, that begins off in verse 2. So, the me here, that pronoun referencing Isaiah, and he says, the treacherous one acts treacherously, and the destroyer destroys. Sounds rather obvious, right? It's what treacherous people and destructive people do. They prove themselves to be traitors, or they destroy things. You wouldn't expect anything other than that would be rather uncharacteristic of them. But the question that looms large is, who is the treacherous one, right? So he's building a mystery for us. We're working through the parts. That's what we're wanting to get to, is who is he talking about, what lay in store for them. Then he says, advance, Elam, lay siege, you Medes. So if you look at that map up there, which I know may be a little bit difficult to see, but I'm going to bring up my laser pointer here and try to help you a little bit. So you can see this green area right here, that's the massive kingdom of Babylon. Now, at some point in time, it's either ruled by Assyria or it's in rebellion against Assyria. It's its own sovereign, independent regional power again. But again, that continues to go back and forth quite a few times over the centuries of Assyria's dominance until eventually 612 BC. That's the date we want to mark on our calendars. If we're remembering 722 is the sacking and end of Samaria as an independent kingdom in the north of Judah, and then 586 is when the Babylonians come and they lay siege to Jerusalem and they eventually conquer all of Judah and then cart them off into exile. 612 would be another good date to memorize. And why? Even though it has absolutely nothing to do with either of those two kingdoms, yet it is the hard and fast date that we have in which Babylon conquers Assyria. And with that, it does help us tease out some of what is being said by guys like Isaiah when it comes to the oracles they present, when in his day and time, Assyria is the dominant power, but he's already speaking about the prominence of Babylon and the assurance that they are going to one day supersede Assyria, right? So, notice off to their east, this massive territory that almost rivals Babylon in size, and that is the kingdom of Elam. And what is not included here, but an almost equal size territory, is about that big, if you saw me marking that out, and that is the kingdom of Media, or the Medes. So he is encouraging that both of these kingdoms advance. Advance on who should be the question, right? And go where? Now, if this is pointed towards Babylon, and this is the reason why I say it's not a good idea to just follow the clue given by your subheading. If you're familiar with the history of Scripture, and of course, world events, you understand that Babylon is eventually going to fall out of power. Per Daniel's words, they will be conquered. It's the head of gold on that colossal image. There's going to be another kingdom that will eventually take over for them. Who is that? Who conquers the Babylonians? Persians. Okay, but we also understand too that at this particular time, the Persians are not working by themselves. In fact, the very night that Belshazzar, the current reigning king in Babylon, he's actually a co-regent. The rightful king is overall actually in the Persian capital of the empire. I hope that makes sense. It's just the fact that he is not there in Babylon at the time these events in Daniel 5 actually transpire. But nonetheless, when he is executed that night, a man by the name of Darius the Mede is actually coronated as king over the Chaldean province of the now expanded Persian Empire. Okay, so the Medes and the Persians are working together in tandem to conquer the kingdom of Babylon. Eventually, the Persians are just going to basically overtake and assimilate the Median territory and their power structure into their own empire, and there will be no separate kingdom on their own, right? All that to say, if we're thinking based off the subheading, a pronouncement against Babylon, and the call here, advance you Medes, then what are you thinking about is happening here? Who is being conquered? What's that? Yeah, that's what we're thinking, that they're going to sack the Babylonians. Now, here's the thing, though. If we're thinking the Medes are about to go with the Persians, even though the Persians are not named here, Elam is, and we're putting a question mark there. Well, what role do they play in any of this? If the Medes are about to go and conquer the Babylonians with the Persians in the context of Daniel chapter 5, then we're thinking this is the fall of Babylon. They are no longer a sovereign power. They are now a district of Persia's vast empire. But how do we know that's the case? If what we have gotten here is just a clue given to us by a group or panel of Bible editors, then maybe we have stripped the text of what it's trying to say, and we've done it in injustice, and we're historically situating this at a time it's not meant to be. So again, this is the reason why we call this an intensive. We get into some of these little nerdy details, but it's important for us to recognize that, because if we're not thinking on the right track, it's entirely possible we're going to miss some very key things. Understand, when you go back and actually do the legwork of reading the history of these things outside the Bible, since the Bible doesn't give us any dates, we'll understand that Babylon, as I said earlier, will at times be its own regional independent power. They will have become strong and prominent enough to be able to wrestle off the Assyrians and put their own native king back on the throne, and then they're going to do what they do. They're going to go and try to garner treaties and whatnot to get other people to help them finally end Assyrian rule and dominance. So that way, Babylon can be the big regional power, right? But of course, Assyria, because they're always managing rebellions, in spite of the nastiness of their brutal, barbarous tactics, which they employ quite a few to try to prevent rebellions from happening, and yet because of their barbarous tactics, that's why rebellions often were instigated. So with that, they are having to do the two-pronged thing, kind of like America surrounded by two oceans and maybe having to fight two different battles or battlefronts. That they are taking on the east and they're taking on the west. And of course, with the east, it's always Babylon in their backyard that's giving them the most fuss. So when they can dedicate their sole focus and attention to them, they will. But sometimes because of the level of distraction off in the west, they can't dedicate power and resources to that fight, and it allows Babylon to get the upper hand. Here's the reason why I say that. There's at least 3 to half a dozen times when Babylon pushes Assyria out, claims independence and sovereignty yet again, and then Assyria comes back with a massive army and their emperor leading the charge. They kick the Babylonians' butts, and then they depose that king, execute him, and then put their own Assyrian king back in charge again. So which fall of Babylon to Assyria is this? Or I should say, which fall of Babylon is this? Is it a fall of Babylon to Assyria, or is it a fall of Babylon to the Persians? We don't know yet. Just because the Medes are mentioned here does not mean that this is the moment when Media and Persia are coming in Daniel 5 to take the city over and kill Belshazzar. Does that make sense? Okay. So then you might be asking, well, if that's the case, then how are we to understand this? The Elamites, for the most part, were usually Babylonian allies working against the Assyrians. All right? So if that's the case, now that might be the status quo as goes at the national level. In other words, the understanding between these two nation groups, Babylon and Elam, is that we're buddies, we share a border. It's not going to do us any good to be fighting against each other because neither one of us are strong enough to take on the Assyrians right now. So it's better if we work together. But that doesn't mean that you don't have Elamite mercenaries, guys who are weapons for hire and really good at taking human life, actually in the ranks of the Persian army or the Assyrian army for that matter. If they have no loyalty to their crown, doesn't matter where their country of origin or birth is, you can say that Elam is working for the enemy in that case. But what we're talking about here is at the national level, all right? So Elam, in most cases, allied with Babylonia against, in this case, Assyria, because Persia is not really someone who is on that level of being able to challenge them. In fact, they're not even really at the level of being able to challenge Media at this point. All right, let's go further. So he says to cap off verse 2, I will put an end to all the groaning, which is contextually linked to that phrase, the treacherous one acts treacherously, and the destroyer destroys. All right, so another question would then be, well, what exactly is meant by the groaning? But let's not get too far in the weeds with respect to this. Let's read verse 3. Therefore, I am filled with anguish. Pain grips me like the pain of a woman in labor. I am too perplexed to hear, too dismayed to see. So the question now is, who's filled with anguish and why? What would your guesses be? Isaiah. So, okay, if that's the case, why is Isaiah filled? If we're talking about the destruction of Babylon or someone else, if it's not his own people, why is he filled with terror and anguish at the idea that some other regional power that probably means his own people harm is going to wind up suffering that kind of harm themselves?
Because it's still God's people.
Okay, so that's an operative opinion.
At this point, were they an ally?
As goes Babylon with
Right.
Judah, maybe. So that's one thing to keep in mind because, it's hard sometimes understanding that Isaiah's scroll is a quilt, right? Many of these oracles spoken at different times are rearranged in the pattern that we have now because it gives us the thematic representation of what the book is driving at. So was this oracle spoken at a time like when Hezekiah is currently ruling on the throne? We've worked through the time when Ahaz was, and we've got that moment historically mentioned in the book for us that Ahaz is dead. So that means his co-regent son and now sole king of Judah is the reigning monarch, presumably. But when in Hezekiah's tenure as king would this have been said? So maybe that's kind of going on in the background too. Let's read further. My heart staggers, horror terrifies me. He has turned my last glimmer of hope into sheer terror. What's the glimmer of hope? So let's go with what you're thinking here for a second. That maybe it's the prospect that Babylon is actually allied to the kingdom of Judah here. Now, why would Babylon have allied themselves with Judah? Who were they seeking a partnership against? Assyria. All right, so kind of like what we've talked about in previous chapters with respect to Egypt and all of her promises. That she was saying, you make a play, I'll come back you. Money, men, whatever you need, because your interests are my interests as far as keeping Assyria out of here. If Babylon is pretending to do the same thing, right, but now we see that Babylon is being, in this particular case, fought against by, it would have to be Assyria. And why wouldn't it be the Persians or the Medes, right? Let's think about this historically. If we're in the context of Daniel chapter 5, then at this point, Judah is no more. Number one, so that doesn't make sense. We could be saying that Isaiah is looking very far into the future at this point and dealing solely with the idea that this is the judgment against Babylon. But in what way does this relate to his own people? At this point, they're exiles within the land, and it does them no good, presumably, because Isaiah has not, and he's the first one to mention this, over a century and a half before these events transpire, that Cyrus, the Persian, is going to be the one who lets them go out of captivity. So if he speaks this oracle before he reveals that Cyrus and the Persians are going to wind up putting the Babylonians down and subsuming them as an empire under their own headship, this would provide no hope to Judah. Make sense? It's not going to help them. It's not going to comfort them that Babylon is going to fall, because that would mean their freedom. But it would strike terror in his heart if, on the other hand, this is our buddy across the desert who's supposed to help us in this two-pronged attack against Assyria, and now Assyria is coming to fight them, and if Assyria beats them down, then who over there can help us? Nobody. Prepare a table and spread out a carpet. Eat, drink, rise up, you princes. Oil the shields. Think about that. When we're talking about eating and drinking. Princes present here, nobles. Chances are, if you've got nobles of your own people sitting at the table and you're doing something like oiling up the shields, I can tell you from my days in the army, and maybe some of you have that sort of experience, when anybody who's very important that wears high rank on, well, now it would be their chest, but in my days of beginning, it was their collar. That normally, when the dog and pony show commences, lots and lots of hours have already been invested in every little private you can find, giving them a mop, a broom, a buffer, a squeegee, whatever it takes to clean and to polish and make everything look as shiny as it possibly can be, as if nobody ever walks these halls, nobody ever uses these bathrooms. Why? Because General so-and-so may actually stand there for 2 seconds in that bathroom and look at that sink and just think, wow, that's amazing, or whatever it is that it is, that the reason why they have to. For us, it was always those green scratch pads. You would be amazed at what you can clean with a green scratch pad. But all that to say, oiling the shields might be on par with that. So why would you oil the shields to give them that nice glossy sheen? Why are princes sitting here at the table to dine and eat and drink? What does that seem to suggest? That someone is coming to town. Who would that be? Well, if we're carrying this out further, it's possibly this Babylonian envoy coming from Merodach Baladan in the days of Hezekiah after his miraculous recovery from his illness, and they are sitting them down to host them at the table because it took them months to get here and it will take them months to get home. You don't insult people in this day and time by not offering them the basic of these accommodations, right? And if we're talking about emissaries sent from a king, you treat them, as the diplomats they are, as if you were entertaining that king or his sons. So with that in mind, it makes sense that he would make this statement of preparing, of eating and drinking, and so forth. So we should think of this as if it's being said to those at Hezekiah's table, that Isaiah is saying to them, prepare the table, spread out a carpet, eat, go ahead, eat, drink, rise up, oil the shields, as if to say, go ahead and make your schemes and plans, because I'm telling you, this is not going to come to fruition in the way that you think it will. Because the Lord said to me, so if all along that pronoun has been Isaiah, we should understand it hasn't changed, go post a lookout. Let him report what he sees. But this is actually reflective of Isaiah's role as the prophet. Remember, read the words of Ezekiel chapter 3 or 33. And what do you see Ezekiel being termed as? He is considered a what? A watchman on the walls. And he is being held responsible for what he hears, what he sees, and passing that on, or else the blood guilt of the people will rest on his hand and his head. Any questions so far? Let's keep going. Verse 7. So let me read the text first. I forgot to do that. My apologies. Let me read the whole text through and then we'll work through it. When he sees riders, this being the watchman, pairs of horsemen, riders on donkeys, riders on camels, he must pay close attention. Then the lookout reported, Lord, I stand on the watchtower all day, and I stay at my post all night. Look, riders come, horsemen in pairs. And he answered, saying, Babylon has fallen, has fallen. All the images of her gods have been shattered on the ground. My people who have been crushed on the threshing floor, I have declared to you that what I have heard from the Lord of armies, the God of Israel. So this mention of riders, pairs of horsemen, donkeys, maybe this is a mounted troop riding to battle. Or it's possible also that this could be the envoy of those who are fleeing while they still can after the battle itself has commenced. But again, what battle are we talking about? To make sure that we all have this straight in our minds, it is potentially the battle of Assyria against Babylon in the days of Merodach Baladan, and Assyria is going to get rid of this guy, and when they do, they are going to reassert their dominance and power over Babylon, and whatever came from this meeting with him and Hezekiah, and whatever promises and overtures were made are going to be null and void. It's 1929 stock market crash. Today we were rich, tomorrow we're all poor and broke because Babylon has lost the battle. So it's either the Assyrians coming or it's the Babylonians fleeing. It very well may be both. So now, skipping down to verse 9. And he answered me, saying, Babylon has fallen. Babylon has fallen. Notice in these verses, between 8 and 9, we have an exchange between the watchman, and who is the watchman? Isaiah, and the Lord. In verse 8, the lookout, Isaiah reports, Lord, I've stood on the watchtower all day and all night. I don't abandon my post. And then he, being the Lord, answering back in verse 9, Babylon has fallen. Babylon has fallen. So Babylon will fall, but again, we need to ask ourselves the question, when is this? Is this the 8th century? So roughly 705 would be the time in which Assyria comes and takes over Babylon again. And that's a few years before Sennacherib, because he's the one sitting on the throne at this point, is going to wind up coming down to Judah, and he's the one responsible for pinning up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage after he destroys those 46 fortified cities, right? So we know this guy knows a thing or two about how to lead an army, host a conquest, and destroy nations, right? All the images of our gods have been shattered to the ground. This is one of those moments where I failed to proofread. I get busy, and I was going to put something else in that thought bubble. It's not meant to be a copy-paste of that. So I will put my thought in there now. To say all of her images and her gods have been shattered on the ground, coming from the Lord, this is one of those things that makes interpreting Isaiah a little tricky, because this is where proponents of the 7th century date, in other words, when the Medes and Persians team up together, the 6th century date, team up together, Daniel chapter 5, come in, take over the city, kill the king, and then now they're in charge. Those proponents would come to this and say, that would be when that happens. Because to say that Babylon's images, gods, all lying smashed on the ground, that would be an image of total decimation. In reality, the Medes and the Persians never do such a thing, right? They're not interested in going in and destroying their temples if they don't have to lay siege to the city and completely destroy it for the sake of taking them over. And because of their craftiness, they were able to just literally waltz right under the walls and kill the king, and now the city's theirs without having to destroy this prized jewel of the eastern side of the Mesopotamian or the Euphrates River. All that to say, though, that doesn't necessarily mean that this particular statement has anything to do with this particular battle between Assyria and Babylon. Now, I can hear what you're all thinking. You're like, well, then what are you getting at? Which is it? Now I'm confused. I thought you were saying it's not the Medes and Persians against Babylon. It's instead Assyria against Babylon. But now you're saying this is referencing a whole different battle. How do we know which one is which? I'm not saying that this is even a reference to a battle. Those two lines by themselves could very well be spelling out what the eventual and inevitable doom of Babylon is. That at one point there will come a time in her future when her gods will be no more. They will not be a refuge for them to look to. They will not be a source of power or protection for them to go and pray to and seek guidance from her enemies. There will come a time when Babylon's total decimation will occur. But in reality, that moment is not going to play out the way you and I might think. Not the way it does in the days of Joshua, when he goes and he destroys a town, puts the whole thing to fire, and then decapitates all their images and idols from the archaeological records we have of these kinds of conflicts. Babylon is just going to slowly dwindle and become an uninhabited city that's consumed by the dust of the desert, rather than a city that's just razed to the ground and completely destroyed and turned into fire or turned into ash by fire. All right? So this is just a pronouncement then, perhaps, of what is going to eventually happen to Babylon, but is not going to happen in this immediate context. But it's pronounced as though it will. I know. It's confusing. Any questions so far? Does everybody know who we're talking about and what we're talking about?
Syrians, Babylonians.
There we go. So then Isaiah is going to top this off with saying, my people. So who are Isaiah's people? So now we're back on to Israel. My people who have been crushed on the threshing floor. I've declared to you what I've heard from the Lord of armies, the God of Israel. So crushed. In what way? Up until this point, in what way has his own people, which while we say it's Israel, more technically it's Judah and Jerusalem, because that's where he lives, that's where he's from, and from the opening words of Isaiah 1, this is who he's been speaking to this whole time. So with that in mind, how have they been crushed? This is why it's important to try to use the scratch pad to keep out or to mark out the historical dates. They have no more allies. If this is that particular moment when Assyria has now put Babylon down, and then eventually they're going to turn their eyes westward, and in a few years, like I said, they're going to come over there, and they're going to lay siege to Judah because Hezekiah will rebel against them. Then they will be crushed then. But they've already in some ways been crushed. You remember in the days of Ahaz, Tiglath-Pileser III comes down because Ahaz says, hey, Israel and Aram are being really mean to me right now. So if I pay you off, will you go and slap them on the back of the head and show them how big you are, and maybe you'll scare them off? And Tiglath-Pileser is all too willing to be accommodated and take all that gold that Ahaz takes out of the temple and strips off the doors and whatnot to give to him. But he's thinking there's probably more there, and so he runs right up on into the town, and he takes all he wants. And then he tells Ahaz, I'm in charge, and you do what I say. And if I don't like you, I will take your head off your shoulders, and I'll put somebody on the throne who will. And from that point on, Judah is no longer a sovereign, independent kingdom for the most part. So if that's the case, even before the days of Hezekiah's sole regnal rule, they've already been crushed in lots of ways. So the overall impact of this burden is what? I think Brandon's already kind of summed it up for us in saying that they have no more allies. And so my people who've already been crushed, if you thought reprieve was on its way by Babylon gaining dominance over Assyria, it's the exact opposite. So don't hope in that. Again, Judah's hope rests in Yahweh alone. So continuing on, now we're switching focus here, and we're actually moving away from Babylon. We're going to do the same thing, right? We're not going to pay attention to the subtitles. Instead, what we have here is a pronouncement or a masah, a burden against this place called Duma. Then we move on with one calls to me from Seir. Watchman, what is left of the night? Watchman, what is left of the night? The watchman said, morning has come and also night. How do they come together? If you want to ask, ask. Come back again. Then we move on with verse 13. A pronouncement against Arabia. In the desert brush you will camp for the night, you caravans of Dedanites. Bring water for the thirsty, the inhabitants of the land of Tema. Meet the refugees with food, for they have fled from swords, from the drawn sword, from the bow that is strung, and from the stress of battle. For the Lord said this to me, within 1 year, as a hired worker counts years, all the glory of Kedar will be gone. The remaining Kedarite archers will be few in number, for the Lord, the God of Israel, has spoken. So, one calls to me from Seir. Where is Seir? And who is the me here? So let's answer these two questions. Anybody have any idea where Seir is? You don't have to point it out on a map, but can you tell me what kingdom it might belong to? Edom. There we go. It's exactly right.
How did you know that?
It belongs to Edom. But now it's in the northwestern territory of Edom, so it's literally within sight from the southern borders of what would have been Judah at that time, on a nice clear day when no big dust storms are rolling through the desert, the parts of the Arabah. But who is the me here? Notice what is said to me, whoever this is. He's called watchman. So we're not done with the chapter yet. We're still in that context. Isaiah. So it's like calling from Mount Seir across the southern border into Israel or Judah, all the way up to Jerusalem. Watchman, what do you see? Tell us what's left of the night. But the next question would be, what does night mean? Night here would have to be a euphemism, a negative term used as metaphor or reference for Judean oppression. What is left of the night from your vantage point? All right? So Judean oppression doesn't mean that Judah has just went through some battle or big conflagration in which now they have been decimated and somebody else is in charge. All this simply means is that someone else is ruling over you and they're calling the shots. And again, if we are historically aligning this with Hezekiah's reign, with what we just said about Ahaz, is Judah really in charge of their own kingdom yet? No. because since the days of his father, they've been answerable to Assyria and paying tribute to Assyria. Notice what he says. Morning has come. All right, so if we're thinking in these terms of our people are under the oppressive hand of a larger ruling power and we're no longer sovereign. So morning has come. That would be a signal that what is about to end? The oppression. So that would sound like a great thing. But if night is also coming with that, then if night is the antithesis of morning, what does that spell out?
I think these are worse than the one we had.
That's exactly right. Morning has come, but also night. So the morning will come. Sennacherib will eventually be defeated at some point, but night will come right after that. And when it does, who is bringing that? Well, in his time, Sennacherib's going to be assassinated by one of his own sons, but he's pretty much the last great king that rules over the Assyrian Empire, because within just about 100 years, sure, but within a few decades, we're going to see a dwindling of kings and a shrinking down of Assyrian territory, empire, and power, and eventually the Babylonians are going to be able to, by themselves, take on Assyria and finally end them. So now we go down to Arabia. Let's read these words again. They're out in the desert, and then they're told that they need to camp. Stay out there for the night. You caravans of Dedanites. So you're like, Dedanites, this is one of those things where you really got to go back to Genesis and look at all those genealogical tables and understand who the Dedanites are, where they came from. But suffice it to say, Dedanites, those from Shibna, Timnah, all of these are those who are desert dwellers and live in what we would call today Saudi Arabia. But of course, those borders are more expansive then than they are now. So the inhabitants of Timah are supposed to bring out water, and they're going to meet refugees with food. So when we describe a scenario like that, in a context where there's refugees needing food and water, what has caused the need for these things? What has caused the reason for why refugees even exist? What has just happened? Somebody took over their land, invaded, nasty war, and so these are people who tried to get away from that. So the desert tribes of the Arabians are going to meet them, and this is probably the time when Babylon is being crushed by Assyria. And if you see on this particular map, it doesn't show a distinction like we have in the previous slides between Assyria and Babylon, but right around this area would be the extent of Babylon's kingdom whenever they do rule over themselves. So if Assyria has come back into that land, taken them over again, these Babylonians are fleeing off into the west. And if that's the case, you might be wondering, why don't they flee over here into the kingdoms of the Medes and Elamites? No one's saying that they're not. It's just saying that these people are getting out and going wherever they can. And I would say geographically it would be based off what's closer in proximity to you to get out as fast as you possibly can. So then, finishing this up, well, that does finish this up. And the Kedar, that's another city out there in the Arab region. And so to say that within 1 year they're all going to be decimated, someone else will have taken over. Who would that be? Assyria. Assyria is going to come, and they are going to systematically dismantle all the regional powers along the Levantine area that is where Judah is situated, right? So they are going to come and invade this particular spot. They're going to kick all the Arabs' butts before they eventually wind up going down and taking over Egypt, right? Like we talked about last week. We haven't gotten to that point yet where the Cushites are being dominated by the Assyrians, but that's coming. So, any questions on this? All right, now we're in chapter 22. So let's once again ignore our subtitle. I'm not putting that up there. I think we can train ourselves at this particular point not to look at that. A Massah concerning the Valley of Vision. I'm just going to dispel this now. I have not found a single commentator or scholar that can tell me why this is named the Valley of Vision. It has something to do, apparently, with the play on words that would have been all too obvious in the days of Isaiah, and at this point has just been lost, even to Jewish antiquity. So with that in mind, we're just going to have to treat that for what it is, big question mark, but we really can't infer what exactly that means. A pronouncement concerning the Valley of Vision. What's the matter with you? What have all of you gone up to the roofs to see? The noisy city, the jubilant town is filled with celebration. Your dead didn't die by the sword. They weren't even killed in battle. All your rulers have fled together, captured without a bow. All your fugitives were captured together. They have all fled far away. Therefore, I said, look away from me. Let me weep bitterly. Do not try to comfort me about the destruction of my dear people. For the Lord God of armies had a day of tumult, trampling, and confusion in the valley of Vision. People shouting, crying to the mountains. Elam took up a quiver with chariots and horsemen, and Kir uncovered the shield. Your best valleys were full of chariots, and horsemen were positioned at the city gates. He removed the defense of Judah. You're like, what is happening here? Okay. So at first, we're wondering, where is the Valley of Vision? Who is this in reference to? Maybe the text might give us a clue. We'll continue to search for that and wait for that clue to pop up as it goes. However, with respect to the opening of this oracle, what's the matter with you? Obviously, the person who is speaking here in the first person has a big problem with the way these people are conducting themselves. And as he goes on to say, they're up on the rooftops. There could be a number of reasons for that. A person can be up on the rooftop in sackcloth and sitting in ash and be mourning. Doesn't mean it's an overt sign of celebration. But the noisy city, the jubilant town, well, there must be a party going on. It's filled with celebration. So it's overtly obvious there is a good time going on. The question remains, though, what is this over? We just got done talking about the Babylonians losing in a big battle to the Assyrians. And if that's the case, Israel, I keep trying to say Israel, Isaiah is warning these people, you need to understand the impact of that. The implications are that your ally over there can no longer back your play, and you have nothing to celebrate over. In fact, you have much to be worried about. So now we roll out of chapter 21 into this, and they're all celebrating. Would they be celebrating then the defeat of Babylon by Assyria? No, that would be a complete total paradox. So we've shifted frame of reference here. Something else is going on, right? But what we can say is if the events of chapter 21 are occurring in the days of Hezekiah's reign, in the time when Merodach Baladan is sending envoys, well, there's lots of things the Bible tells us about what happened in Hezekiah's rule as king. It wasn't just the Babylonians sending an envoy. In fact, a lot of attention is paid to a big, huge military conflagration that happens in the days of Hezekiah. We've already danced around that sombrero plenty in the various lessons we've already had. Rulers have fled together, captured with the bow. So whoever this is, that is the Valley of Vision, has in some way had to interface with somebody in a very negative way, such that some of their particular nobles, magistrates, people who are in charge, have been captured, potentially taken as prisoners of war, or they have fled. They've been chased away. So not something to really celebrate over, but it would seem like whoever is the Valley of Vision or dwells beside this valley, that they won in the end. That whatever this military conflagration was, it ended in their favor. So if we're thinking days of Hezekiah, military conflagration, but ended well for somebody, not sure who that is yet, our minds should already be focusing or shifting our frame of focus over to something that we know is a poignant part of Hezekiah's tenure as king. It'll make sense in a minute. So it's difficult to ascertain when this occurs. Is this the siege of Jerusalem under Sennacherib? Or is it the siege of Jerusalem under Nebuchadnezzar? It wouldn't make sense if it's in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, because there's never really a moment for them to be rejoicing. Now, a caveat to that. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't come but just one time to lay siege to Jerusalem. Scholars are divided on this. There's at least two. This is ironclad. Two moments when he comes to lay siege to Jerusalem, and he deports lots of people. That was an earlier movement that brought Daniel into the city. There may have been a separate movement that actually brought Ezekiel into Babylon before Daniel arrives. If that's the case, we're looking at 3 separate sieges, and at least the last one was the one that did the city in altogether. But if it's not Nebuchadnezzar, as goes a moment for them to actually have a chance to rejoice, then it would seem like this would probably be a little bit more aligned with Sennacherib. But then again, we haven't even established if this is Jerusalem yet. We're only playing off the fact that the subheading up there has kind of hinted us into that. So verse 4, let me, who is me here? Isaiah. Why is he saying, let me look away? Here, catch this. Everybody else is running around the city shouting. They're joyous. He will go on to say they are shouting to the mountains. That is a victorious chant. They're not crying out for help. They're happy over what's happened. The city itself is on fire with celebration. He calls it a jubilant town. He says, don't look at me. Let me weep bitterly. So where's his emotional state right now? Are these tears of joy? No, right? Sad. He's totally down in the dumps and glum. So the question would be then, what destruction then has happened amidst this mass celebration? And what instigates his desire to weep bitterly? So I'm going to open that to you. Tell me at this point, what do you think would be a cause for him to want to weep bitterly if there's a cause for celebration in everybody else's mind?
He knows what's coming.
Ah, yeah. He knows what's coming. So in all that he has seen, and even some of what he shared with these people, he knows that even though, if this is in the days of Sennacherib, which means Hezekiah is king, it's that time in which Sennacherib brought the army to Jerusalem's doorstep after laying waste to the rest of Judah, and it's a done deal at this point. There's no way Judah survives. But in one night, the tides turn. What happened?
Lord killed.
We'll just say a bunch.
A
Right?
lot, man.
Yeah.
Hundreds of thousands, over 100,000.
Yeah.
Troops.
Close to 200,000. And so with that, a decimated army, and no explanation as to what happened, except from the vantage point of those who are living in the city, and they know what happened. And with that, there's no way that Assyria can prevail in this battle now, and so they tuck tail and run. And that's even recorded in secular history outside the Bible that happened. And so with that in mind, would that not be a cause then to celebrate? The very idea that what was certain defeat now has become unexplicable victory outside of the fact of God's sovereignty and grace and his merciful act on the part of his people. So, yeah, there would be all the more reason in the world for people to be jumping up and shouting. But Isaiah doesn't want to join the party because he knows what's coming. He knows this is going to actually get worse for them before it ever gets better. Because a day for the Lord of armies has had a day. So this is yet again another reference to a day of the Lord in which he has judged. And of course, if this is indeed the conflagration of Sennacherib coming against Hezekiah, then we understand that was the last piece in the battle, not the first. If 46 towns have been destroyed, completely decimated, and there have already been prisoners taken, and they're not giving them back, then have they not suffered greatly up to this point? Absolutely. It has in every way, shape, and form been a day of the Lord. Extreme judgment. These are the very things that Isaiah was saying earlier when in Isaiah 8 he's talking about how God is going to bring the Euphrates River, hint, hint, king of Assyria, all the way down through Israel, which that's done happened. A whole different king was responsible for their destruction. But now yet again, another Assyrian king who's come down to do the very same thing to them and is literally a hair away from victory until God snatches it out of the jaws of defeat, right? For the defeat for his people. So there is a day of the Lord. But when did this occur and at whose hand? So at this point, we're still pretending like we don't quite know who. Now, I will say, let me back up for a second and just get a little bit nerdy as something of a rabbit trail. Verse 6, Elam took up a quiver with chariots and horsemen, and Ker uncovered the shield. Now, this is a little strange, because if you remember what I said earlier in the lesson, right? Historically, Elam has been the partner of who? Babylon. Okay, so if Elam is involved in this then, and they're partners with Babylon, then that in no way, shape, or form then fits the context of Hezekiah and Sennacherib and the Assyrians. This would bespeak the idea of Nebuchadnezzar coming to town at one point, and maybe this was because Nebuchadnezzar didn't totally decimate the city. He was happy with coming to terms of peace with the king that he now puts in charge, and he lets them maintain some measure of dignity and quasi-sovereignty as long as this king is loyal to him. And because he doesn't totally decimate the city, and there's a glimmer of hope for the future that maybe one day God will do the Babylonians in, and then we can have our sovereignty back. The dynasty of David continues, and all of these wonderful blessings as we continue to be God's covenant people. Shout for joy, we'll count that as a W, right? Because, yeah, we didn't really win, but we didn't totally lose. So, however, everybody gets the trophy. However, remember what we said. Just because at the national level there's a partnership between Babylon and Elam doesn't mean that at the level of the individual that is honored. If there are Elamite mercenaries who have joined the ranks of the Assyrians and are willing to fight for them and have proven themselves loyal and are trusted by their commanders and whatnot on the field, it makes all the sense then that an Elamite soldier might very well be there at the time when Sennacherib is seeking to bring Jerusalem to its knees. Makes sense? Not saying that that's a perfect explanation for this, but it does provide something of an explanation that helps keep this properly referenced in the time of Sennacherib and Hezekiah. Any questions so far? Okay. So we're doing good. We've almost got 28 minutes left, and this is our next to last slide. So we can slow this down just a bit and take our time. Eat up 30 minutes on 2 slides. On that day, you looked to the weapons in the house of the forest. You saw that there were many breaches in the walls of the city of David. You collected water from the pool. You counted the houses of Jerusalem so that you could tear them down to fortify the wall. You made a reservoir between the walls for the water of the ancient pool, but you did not look to the one who made it, or even consider the one who created it long ago. On that day, man, Isaiah loves that phrase, don't he? On which day is the... On that day, the Lord God of armies called for weeping, for wailing, for shaven heads, and for the wearing of sackcloth. But look, joy and gladness, butchering of cattle, slaughtering of sheep and goats, eating of meat, drinking of wine. Let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. The Lord of armies has directly revealed to me, this iniquity will not be wiped out for you people as long as you live. The Lord God of armies has spoken. So in working through this, on that day, the day of his tumult, that day when he brought someone to Judah, and I forgot to mention that. Sorry, let me go back to this slide. Notice verse 8, he removed the defenses of Judah. So now we actually have a reference to a spot on the map, albeit it's not a city, it's a kingdom per se. But then if that's the case, if this is the only people mentioned in this particular oracle, it would seem to suggest that the Valley of Vision has to deal with that particular people group. And that would point us a little bit closer then to the idea this must be Jerusalem, because this is where this final showdown happens. All right? You look to the weapons in the house of the forest. So on that day, when there's a great big battle between Jerusalem and presumably Assyria, it really doesn't fit the reference for anybody else. They look for weapons in the house of the forest. What is that? Does that ring a bell for anybody, that phrase? Solomon, exactly. Because that's a part of his palace. And it's a very ornate part of the palace, mind you. It's got a lot of that cedar wood that came from Lebanon and so forth. And it's an extension then of God's palace. We're not supposed to understand them as being two separate entities. They work in tandem with each other. It's God's throne and his son ruling at his right hand on his throne, mimicking what is present above as well, right? All that to simply say, this was also the place where Solomon decides to move the shields that David made and place them there, not to just be ornate emblems, but at the same time, for something like this, palace guards would go and grab them. We know that at times they're taken away, but they're replaced with cheaper quality imitations. And even in the days when Joash is coronated as king against his usurping grandmother, Athaliah, this is where they go and grab these shields and spears from. You saw that there were many breaches in the wall in the city of David. I'm skipping to verse 10. You counted the houses of Jerusalem so that you could tear them down to fortify a wall. That means you decided right here is where we're going to have to build a very hasty wall to prevent the advance of the enemy. So that seems to kind of put us in a time frame that we can work with if there's any other corroborating information in the Bible that helps us know who did such a thing. When we read 2 Chronicles 32, because none of this is contained in the book of Kings, then Hezekiah strengthened his position by rebuilding the entire broken down wall and heightening the towers and the other outside wall. He repaired the supporting terraces of the city of David, and he made an abundance of weapons and shields. That doesn't tell us, though, that he actually tore down houses to build a wall. While there is archaeological evidence of this, there is also the understanding on the part of both secular and, let's go religious, because we're talking Jewish and Christian historians and archaeologists alike. This has always been attributed to Hezekiah and no other king, that such a monumental effort was taken under for the sake of defending against the Assyrians, because no mention of this is done by any other king, and the only other time in which something would ever be needed like this would have been during the days of the Babylonians. But we understand, though, that while the Babylonians have come and they fought against them multiple times before they finally take over and burn the whole city down, go back to the days of Ahaz. And who is Ahaz to Hezekiah? His father. What happened during his days? Israel comes down, Aram comes down, Edom comes up, Philistia comes over. All of these kingdoms are coming to attack them. And at certain points, they even go in and they breach the city walls and they take what they want. So if that's the case, Jerusalem's walls and defenses that were set up during the days of not only Solomon and whatnot, but even Uzziah, go back and read his story, right? I mean, he did a lot to fortify the city itself. And he made it far more well prepared for such a thing than it was even in the days of Solomon. And yet all that's been stripped away and torn down. So Hezekiah is having to do what he can to build back those battlements because he knows the Assyrians are coming. Why? Because at this point he's already rebelled against them. All the intelligence coming his way is that they're already on the move. And then we go back to this phrase right here. Finishing up verse 9. You collected water from the lower pool. Now to verse 11. You made a reservoir between the walls for the water of the ancient pool. Now this seems to really put the final nail in the coffin as to when we're talking about and who we're talking about. Because when we continue on in 2 Chronicles 32, Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come and that he planned war on Jerusalem. So he consulted with his officials and his warriors about stopping up the water of the springs that were outside the city, and they helped him. And to this day, this conduit still stands, and you could walk right through this thing. Hezekiah's tunnel, in which he fortified the Gihon spring outside to funnel it into the city so that the Assyrians couldn't find it and strip them of their fresh water supply. So if that's the case, it really seems to solidify the fact we're talking about Hezekiah in the time of Sennacherib when they're coming. So if we seem to have gotten all that figured out then, what does that mean? Well, let's continue to read on for the implications of what's coming here. And it really starts to work to change our understanding here. When you go back to Kings, the author of Kings is not even remotely concerned about telling you about any of the spiritual stuff that these kings are responsible for, other than the fact this king may have built shrines and idols. But they don't tell you that they are leading them to egregious apostasy and what that looks like. They just give you the understanding that things are bad because they allow these things to happen, or they don't tear down the high places. Looking at you, Judah. But when we get to Chronicles, on the other hand, that person is even taking out some of these reigns of Davidic kings to greatly expand upon these kings who had more to contribute, either good or bad, or both during their tenure as kings. So when you read the king's account of Hezekiah, you get none of this about how he prepared the city. But you do get about how he repaired the temple, and he tried to bring the people back in alignment with God's covenant in celebrating Passover. The writer of Chronicles gives us all of that, and as we've seen, more. In both accounts, we've got glowing reports, with the exception of Hezekiah entertaining the Babylonian envoys and opening up the doors to show them all the treasures that he has, right? But it still leaves the question then, what's the spiritual climate of Jerusalem at this time? I mean, think about it. The days of his father Ahaz, when he was, if there was a spiritual prostitute, him and Manasseh were the guys. He had totally slammed up the doors of the temple. Nobody can go inside. Priests are forbidden from going into that place. The altar that Solomon made for burnt offerings has been taken off of its stand and put to the side. And this massive altar that is an exact replica of the one the king in Damascus, Aram, uses. Right? Well, I should say it's not Aram. It's actually the king of Assyria who met him at Damascus. And he sent those plans back for an Israelite high priest to take the place of the burnt offering, altar of burnt offering. And then at this point, Ahaz is commissioned for shrines and altars to be on literally every corner in the streets of Jerusalem for all these gods. So wickedness and apostasy is at an absolute all-time high before Hezekiah takes over as the sole ruling monarch. He's got a lot to do to repair just the spiritual climate, not to mention the structural integrity of the city, to prepare for a siege. All that to say, when Sennacherib advances, and we have his Rabshakeh, his Tartan, his Rabsaris standing there taunting the people, looking down from the walls, listening to them when they're saying, isn't Hezekiah the one who's offended your God in saying that you're not to offer burnt offerings to him? Totally misconstruing the actual history of what he had done. But nonetheless, all that to simply say, we get this picture of the stoicism that we see in Kings and Chronicles of how these people who are seemingly all aligned with Hezekiah are right in line with his agenda, that they are worshiping Yahweh again in soul faithfulness to the covenant. But how do we know that's really the case? What in the text actually tells us that's where everybody is? We don't have that clue. But what we do have is additional information being offered to us from Isaiah, who was alive and in the city at the time these things are playing out. So let's listen to this. You did not look to the one who made it, or consider the one who created it long ago. That's a charge. Who is this charge levied against? Well, who's the one who saw the breaches in the wall and repaired them? Who's the one that decided we are going to fortify the water supply? But it's being said here, either collectively to the city, we're talking chiefs, nobles, everybody, and or the king. But you didn't consider the one who made it. You did not look to me first. So when and at what point did Hezekiah get sincere with the Lord? I mean, granted, before Hezekiah walks in with a letter that was written by the hand of Sennacherib into the temple to pray and beseech God for his help against their enemies, he's already made the effort to repair the temple and celebrate Passover. So when and at what point, though, was this charge made against him in all of this? Just because things seem to have been going well during that time and he's doing all the right things and trying to honor the Lord doesn't mean when the heat got turned up and he realizes this is about to get real, that at that moment he decides, you know what? Come what may, we're in the hands of the Lord. Now, if any of you in here were the Bible scholars I hope to see you all become someday, and I'm certainly not, you would be able to pull that verse right out from where it is in Chronicles and Kings, where he says, when he goes to his nobles and they're frantic with fright, thinking there's no way we're going to survive this, he tells them, do not fear, because the one who is with us is greater than the one who is with them. So you might think, well, then this doesn't really marry up with Hezekiah. It seems like Hezekiah knew from the outset of this event that God was going to be the one to determine the victor, them or the Assyrians, one way or the other, right? So who is this actually levied against? Is it Hezekiah? Is it the people? We're not really clear in this. But what we do have is the understanding that when we get on to verse 12, on that day when the Assyrians come to town, the Lord God of armies calls for weeping, wailing, shaven heads. All these are signs of what? Right. This puts us kind of back in the frame of reference to what we just looked at last week with respect to the story of Jonah and Jonah in Nineveh and saying, 40 days, 40 nights, God's going to overthrow the city. And they then commence to go putting on sackcloth and ashes and repenting. God has called for this. But in the context of Kings and Chronicles, when did God call for that? Do we ever hear of Isaiah in those particular texts going to the people and saying, you need to shave your head. Beard's got to come off. Need to put on the sackcloth. Everybody start burning some wood because we need ashes all around. Fasting and mourning for everybody, top down. This is the only place this is mentioned. And seemingly it's spurned, because when we get into verse 13, but instead of these things, look what happens. Joy, gladness, butchering of cattle, slaughtering of sheep and goats, eating of meat, drinking of wine. Let's eat, drink, for tomorrow we die. Now, this is a little confusing too, because the question is when did this happen? When they say, eat, drink, tomorrow we die, you would think that the celebration is happening at what point? Before what?
Before the slaughter.
Before, exactly. But the celebration really wouldn't make sense if that's the case, because everybody at that point is just completely nonsensical. I mean, why in the world, if you know for sure death is almost imminent because there's no way you can defend against this massive army, would you dare say on the last night of my life, I'm just going to drink myself into a stupor because tomorrow I know I'm going to die? Some crazy people might be doing that, but not the whole city. That would seem to fit a little bit more so with the idea of what happens after the slaughter, right? That's when everybody's jubilantly celebrating. But nonetheless, what we have here is something that God is obviously not pleased with, and he considers it to be sinful. And he says this iniquity will not be wiped out for you people as long as you live. So what are they ultimately guilty of then? Iniquity being another word for sin. Why is God displeased with this behavior?
They're not calling upon him.
Okay, so there's that. They're not leaning upon him as they should be, as their refuge, their rock of their salvation.
Well, I suppose the domination by the Assyrians was meant to be a type of discipline that would bring them back to the Lord, and all they're doing instead is just kind of going the opposite direction.
Yeah, I mean, it's like coming down off Mount Carmel. Elijah expects the total transformation of the nation to happen, and it never materializes. The same thing here. He knows what's coming. They don't really understand yet that Babylon is going to be on their heels at some point within a century or so. But nevertheless, that's coming, and this was a time for them to understand this for what it was. But they don't. They don't read it. They don't appreciate the times for what they are. And because of this is how they're going to respond to God. It's going to lead to even more dire consequences. So we have a pronouncement against Shebna, and this will close out the chapter for us. So again, we're going to ignore our subheading. Just saying that because we want to make sure we understand. Let's don't take that for granted, and let's let the text speak for itself. But in verse 15, it's told us very clearly who we're talking about here. The Lord God of armies, go to Shebna, that steward who is in charge of the palace, and say to him, what are you doing here? Who authorized you to carve out a tomb for yourself here, carving your tomb on the height and cutting a resting place for yourself out of rock? Look, you strong man, the Lord is about to shake you violently. He will take hold of you, wind you up into a ball, sling you into a wide land. There you will die, and there your glorious chariots will be, a disgrace to the house of your Lord. I will remove you from your office, and you will be ousted from your position. And on that day, I will call for my servant, Eliakim, son of Hilkiah. I will clothe him with your robe and tie your sash around him. I will hand your authority over to him, and he will be like a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. I will place the key of the house of David on his shoulder. What he opens, no one can close, and what he closes, no one can open. And get your mind out of Revelation here. I know that's what you're thinking. Let's pay attention. I will drive him like a peg into a firm place. He will be a throne of honor for his father's family, and they will hang on him all the glory of his father's family, the descendants and the offshoots, all the small vessels from bowls to every kind of jar. And then on that day, the declaration of the Lord of armies is, the peg that was driven into a firm place will give way, be cut off, and fall, and the load on it will be destroyed. Indeed, the Lord has spoken. So, first question might be then, to us, who is Shebna? It says here that he is the steward in charge of the palace. But if you've been reading your Bible up to this point, what you've already come across is that in accounts such as Kings and so forth that parallel for us the information given also in Isaiah 38 through 39, actually I should say 36 through 39, that Shebna is mentioned along with this Eliakim character, and he is not called the steward in charge of the palace. He is called the king's court secretary. And Eliakim is the one who is referred to as the steward of the palace. So which is it, and why? And in this particular account, it seems like there's a total reversal of roles. And so maybe from the vantage point of the writer of Kings, they have already reflected that for us and told us, even though at that particular moment it probably wasn't the case. Shebna probably actually was the steward of the palace, and Eliakim the court secretary, and then their roles reversed after this proclamation by Isaiah that's only recorded in his scroll. But then again, the question is, what did Shebna do that was so bad? I mean, this is obviously God judging him But for what? What can you isolate from the text at this point that is so bad that God would bring judgment on his head? While you're thinking on that, I'm going to read to you from Isaiah 36. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, King Sennacherib of Assyria attacked all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. Then the king of Assyria sent his royal spokesman along with a massive army from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem. The Assyrians stood near the conduit of the upper pool by the road to the launderer's field. Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, who was in charge of the palace, but remember here, that's Isaiah 36, but in Isaiah 22, Shebna is in charge of the palace, right? So this is actually just reflecting right from what the book of Kings has to say. Shebna, the court secretary, and Joah, son of Asaph, the court historian, came out to him. Then Eliakim, Shebna, and Joah said to the royal spokesman, "Please speak to your servants in Aramaic, since we understand it. Don't speak to us in Hebrew within earshot of the people who are on the wall." Later on in the chapter, then Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, who was in charge of the palace, Shebna, the court secretary, and Joah, son of Asaph, the court historian, came to Hezekiah with their clothes torn and reported to him the words of the royal spokesman. That's interesting. All three of these officials have torn their robes in mourning, and they are bearing sackcloth at this point. Oh, I'm sorry, I added that. They've torn their robes to bear out their mourning. Then we go to the first two verses of Isaiah 37. When King Hezekiah heard their report, he tore his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, and went to the Lord's temple. He sent Eliakim, who was in charge of the palace, Shebna, the court secretary, and the leading priests who were covered with sackcloth, to the prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz. That is right out of Kings as well. It's almost word for word. So in every place we have this Shebna mentioned for us in Scripture, that is what you find him doing. He is engaging this Assyrian envoy. He is representing the king, and seemingly faithfully, he is trying to protect his people by encouraging those people to speak in Aramaic and not in Hebrew, so that way they alone understand the message, and they can carry that information to the king so the people aren't frightened into panic and hysteria. And then when they realize what's going on, all three of them, including this Shebna guy, has torn their clothes. And then at some point it seems like they, along with the king, don sackcloth. This is the only other frame that we get of Shebna. So again, all that is said of him here is that he carved out a tomb for himself in Jerusalem, carving out his tomb on the height and cutting a resting place for yourself out of rock. And then he's referred to as a strong man. God is about to shake you violently, ball you up, sling you off into a land that is wide, far from here, and there you will die. It's rather mysterious, isn't it? So based off this information, what can we say of this guy? That he has garnered God's judgment and now become an archetypal example that is part of Isaiah's oracle, preserved for posterity so that we can look back on and say, it's probably not a good idea to do what this dude did.
Because he didn't have any faith in Yahweh. I mean, because he built this sepulcher for himself, and we have no hope.
Brilliant. Exactly. Because to do such a thing, number one, even though he is a high-ranking court-appointed official, or I should say high-ranking royal-appointed official of the king's court, doesn't necessarily mean that he should be attributed such customary accoutrements and death or whatnot. But all that to say, even if he's got the money for buying himself an ornate tomb, and even if he's doing this, maybe not so much, because it's hard for us to say for sure, he's doing this in advance of what he thinks is going to be the inevitable demise of Judah, that for sure the Assyrians are going to come to town and kill them all, and those few survivors will potentially be able to bury the victims, and that he'll be able to be buried in this ornate tomb where his descendants after him will be gathered to him in and whatnot. Maybe he was just doing this knowing that at some point he's going to die. Most of the people who are alive at this time really don't live very much after the age of 40, and so who knows how old he is. Maybe that's just 5 years away from now. Why is the carving of a tomb out of rock so bad? But that really would seemingly make the only bit of sense we can out of this. That he is vaunting himself in his pride. He refuses to look to Yahweh. And by virtue of that, even though he has all the external signs of fitting in and doing the right things, yet God sees his heart and weighs it. And by virtue of that, this is his edict on him. And the other compatriot of his who's right beside him, step in step with every frame we see these guys operating in, Eliakim, on the other hand, is the true example of open sincerity and trust in the Lord, because God is now going to elevate him. Much in the same way Mordecai is elevated when the evil Haman is destroyed and Mordecai gets his palace, he gets the king's signet ring, all the things that Haman wanted to be honored by the king with, he gets because of his faithfulness. Same here. He gets a position, and now Eliakim is the one who was in charge of the palace. But all that to say, it's weird too, though, with all the description that is given of Eliakim and the way he will be elevated. He is going to be an honorary throne for his family. He is going to be the tent peg that the tension of the court of his family is going to be tied to, and the thing that is holding them in place. But then we get this reference around verse 24 on to 25, that instead of being a peg that's driven into the ground to which you tie the cable of the tent around, that now the rest of his family is being hung on him, like he's a peg on the wall. That's where you would hang your bowl, your pot, or something to that effect. His whole entire family's legacy and future is going to be hung on him. And this is how this closes out. The peg that was driven into a firm place will give way. Be cut off. When we see that phrase, be cut off, ever used, what is it in connection with? It's not good. Death, judgment, bad things. To be cut off, fall, the load on it will be destroyed. But does Eliakim do anything to garner such judgment? Nothing in any other text where his name is mentioned ever remotely suggests such a thing. So is this an actual pronouncement of judgment that is going to come upon Eliakim? Or is it really meant to be understood more so as the prospect of what will happen to Eliakim if he continues, or if he fails to continue to remain faithful? That he very well, if he chooses to follow in the pattern of Shebna and let this power get to his head, and he chooses now to use his money to do the very things that Shebna has done, or worse, is it possible that he will suffer the same fate? Well, it's only inevitable he'll suffer the same fate. The question is what do we do with the text, and how do we make sense of this? So, with that in mind, how do we even tie this in to the rest of what we've read so far? What can we say effectively has been the theme of chapters 21 and 22? I know that's a lot. We've went over quite a bit tonight, even though it's just been 2 chapters. But what we have seen in those 2 chapters is that, number one, Babylon is seemingly going to be squished by Assyria. Judgment upon them, right? Assyria is going to come on them. And then in chapter 22, Assyria is turning to the opposite direction, and they're now going to come against Judah. And in the days of Hezekiah, Sennacherib is going to do terrible things to Judah. But in the moment when their army has been decimated by an act of God's divine protection, that the people are jubilantly praising God, but they're not actually meeting out the level of response or the type of response that God wants from them, which is sackcloth and ashes. You people ought to be beating yourselves over the head for the sins that you are responsible for, which raises some questions as to what is going on in the days of Hezekiah as king and what is the spiritual climate. But all that aside, that even though they're acting this way and Isaiah is pronouncing doom that's going to come in the future, then we get these 2 examples of Shebna and Eliakim. Shebna has exalted himself, and he's going to be debased. Eliakim, who has done nothing of the sort, God is going to take and make an example of also. But in the opposite, or the inverse of that, and he is going to exalt him and place all of this wonderful honor and glory on him, and he is going to be an example of what will happen for the posterity of his own family and the people of Jacob in the days to come. And then we're left with this rather ominous phrase that we're still kind of puzzling over and scratching our heads with as to what does this mean? If he's the peg in the wall that's going to fall and be cut off, is it because he does something bad? Is this a warning to the people that, hey, there is the chance for your exaltation in the future? God in his grace is going to make that happen. But just because God does such a thing does not mean that you should not be wary of your steps and how you follow him in faithfulness. And if you fail to, then understand, though God has ladled you with glory, it doesn't mean it won't all come crashing down again. Or is it a way of saying that even though Shebna is going to meet some sort of end, that appears to be exile, because God is saying he's going to sling him out of this land, and he's going to die in another land where all of his chariots now are going to end up in complete, total disgrace. Eliakim is going to be elevated to this position, and we know that Hezekiah is not the last king over Judah, right? There is yet several more that will come after him. And of course, Eliakim is going to die in Judah. So is this just to simply say that Eliakim arises to this position of prominence, but it still spells out the future prospect of doom for the people of Judah because Babylon's going to come knocking on their door someday?
I know that it refers to Eliakim as the peg that's fastened in a secure place, but could it be possible that the last sentence is actually still talking about Shebna, the peg that was fastened in a secure place? It's torn.
You know, I can't say that it's not a possibility because that's the kind of thing we deal with as we move through these passages, right? It's tough to know at certain points who is still being referenced when we get to these types of phrases. Because it does seem, credence to your point, that whereas Eliakim is described as a tent peg, then we have this another peg that's mentioned as the peg in the wall. Two totally different things. And so, again, is it possible the peg in the wall is indeed Shebna? I can't argue against that. And, you know, sometimes when you're reading through scholars' material, what you'll find is that they are not in agreement with each other, but they're not calling each other out over that. You just realize that this person thinks that it's Assyria in this situation, but this person thinks it's totally Babylon. So which one do I go with? You just have to let the text speak for itself and seem to follow the breadcrumb trail as to where it might be going and what it's suggesting. But even that sometimes doesn't give us the full warm and fuzzy that we want. And we just have to, at the end of the day, continue to pray and ask for God to give guidance. And then hopefully something like this nice little intensive can clue some people into a little bit more than they didn't already know. So, any concluding comments or questions?